Guam has always been under the control of some country. From countries like Spain, Japan, and the United States, they have always put their own spin and style on how Guam should function, especially with the political scheme of things. The United States, compared to other nations who controlled the island, had set a different initiative for how much locals can represent themselves in the mainland government. They practice democracy, giving locals and citizens more rights that they can practice in their own home. One example of this is to vote for the next governor of Guam or to decide who their next leaders will be in the Guam legislature. Though they began with appointed naval officials who ran the island, as an order from the U.S. naval government, people from Guam were given free rein to decide how their government should look, while still being under the authority of the United States. And it is evident between the states and the island of Guam that the states have much more freedom over their rights. Those residential practices were granted by the U.S. government. However, there is still one thing that the territories of the U.S. are withheld from: the right to vote for the next president. Before we talk about the presidential vote, we have to discuss how Guam got the political status that they have today. The fight for the right to vote began when the Spanish transferred the island to the United States. During this naval era, the U.S. government appointed many naval governors who would take complete control of the island. Because of the Constitution, territories are not allowed to become states, so they started their journey in a rough spot, where they were given no political authority. Local residents of Guam were not even granted American citizenship, which shows that the political fight started at rock bottom. Guam has been silenced not by their choice, but because of what's stated under the law. In the Attorney General of the Territory of Guam versus the United States case, the Ninth Circuit denied these rights to Guam because the Constitution does not grant them this right, which says that only the states can cast votes in the presidential election. Territories are and always have been excluded from the presidential vote and have been kept in a second-class semi-colonial status. The only way for Guam to truly participate would be through a constitutional amendment, and Guam is still a long way from reaching such an achievement.
The real quest is for political status change. And whatever comes as a result of political status change, if that includes voting for president, then so be it. But the more fundamental question is, does Guam want to become a state? Does Guam want to become more autonomous? Maybe free association or independence?
Things shifted for locals when the Organic Act was signed by President Harry Truman on August 1, 1950. This act was so significant for political representation for Guam as a civil government was established and local residents were granted American citizenship. This was a game changer for the island, as it meant that they would no longer be controlled by the foreign nations that took control of their island. Instead, the people of Guam could make the decisions that they believed were best for the public. A civilian executive branch was also granted, but naval governors still would have authority and power. However, the Guam legislature would be given the chance to override any executive orders or decisions made by the naval governors. This practice could still be exploited though, as they can turn the override back to the Secretary of the Interior, who can bypass the Guam's legislature's override. This was unfair, as it meant that even though Guam was given political representation, it was still as if they were given little to no power in the government. In 1968, the United States Congress passed the Elective Governor Act, in which the people of Guam were able to vote for their own governor and own lieutenant governor. Every election would occur every 4 years, and each governor would be given 2 successive terms, just like how a presidential election would run. Because of this act, many of our governors that were voted by the people of Guam had made successful impacts onto the island in which everybody benefits from, including people like Ricardo Badalio, Carl Gutierrez, and Carlos Camacho, who was the first elected governor of Guam. On April 10, 1972, Guam was given the opportunity to get one non-voting delegate into Congress for 2-year terms. They became a direct source to let the U.S. government become aware of the issues and what is needed for Guam to develop.
During my term of office, we were pushing Commonwealth. So I introduced that legislation, and that legislation also had the only hearing that it ever had in Washington, D.C. Came as a result of my pushing it. And so, that basically was as far as it got.
Though they can't vote, the delegate can still sway other state representatives to side with their beliefs and garner support for Guam's fight for the presidential vote. Elections eventually became a popular vote, where the people of Guam would decide their representatives on the island and in Congress. From 1950 to 1960, the number of registered voters on Guam had doubled, indicating that Guam is exercising the rights that were granted to them. Though, they are still limited to determining what happens on the island and barely have any power outside of it.
The equal rights movement for us here in Guam is an important step in Guam's political power in Washington. And in regards to veterans, it's going to be a big push for us to also let Washington know and let our voices be heard.
If the U.S. government doesn't approve of representation for locals, they find a way to fight the injustice. Delegates like Robert Underwood have attempted to increase Guam's political representation, trying to break any barriers that stop territories from voting.
In terms of voting for president, there is a movement in the United States for a popular vote for president. So if you had a popular vote for president, then you wouldn't be reliant on electors. And then if you don't rely on electors, then you don't need to be a state because you're just part of the citizenry.
While the state citizens have full freedom to practice their right to vote under the Constitution, Guam as a territory is not protected under it and the many amendments that grant American citizens the right to vote. During general elections, Guam voters may put their preference for who they want to be president, but have no real say in who gets to run the nation, along with all the other territories. The states also have full authority to fully influence the presidential election, as they can have representatives in Congress, the Electoral College, and the House of Representatives. Guam is granted one delegate, but is only allowed to hear and debate. Citizens of Guam have to let the citizens in the states decide their fate for who will impact our island as the leader. Guam isn't the only one who is restricted from a presidential vote, but also the other territories of the U.S. For example, the U.S. Virgin Islands delegate Stacey Plaskett interrupted a House Speaker election because territories were not allowed to vote. According to her, there were 4 million people of those territories whose voices were unheard, and she was ultimately cut off. There is some governmental initiative from all territories to be politically represented and treated better, even though we are territories, as it is only fair that we are given a chance to make an impact on what happens to our island, rather than letting people who may not know about Guam get to decide what happens for us. As residents of Guam, we have to take that step too, in order to have a say in the next presidential election. Whether it be through advocacy, legal action, petitions, or through political engagement and practice, we must strive to have the same political benefits as the states. Especially coming from a land of equality and justice. Our voices matter, along with the other U.S. territories, and by getting to be a part of the presidential election run, we can ensure that our struggles and issues are truly acknowledged from the highest form of government.
That will fix a gross injustice within our democracy and finally provide American citizens living in the territories the right to vote for President and Vice President of the United States. Every American should be alarmed that over 4 million of their fellow citizens are denied the right to have a say in the selection of their president. The people of Guam and other U.S. territories are patriotic Americans who contribute to every aspect of American life. We are Americans by birth, bear U.S. passports, and support and defend the Constitution of the United States, many with their lives. Yet, still Americans who reside in the territories are unable to vote for our president. Casting a ballot for president is a right for all Americans, and this amendment is a step toward our Constitution's solemn promise to form a more perfect union.